So welcome. Thank you so much for coming out here tonight to hear what I'll respect your time and make sure it's a brief and informative talk on my new book, Sold My Soul for a Student Loan, Higher Education and the Political Economy of the Future. My name is Daniel Kirsch, and the first thing I'd like to say is that I am very gratified to, here we go. No. All right. I'm very gratified to be here in Racine, Wisconsin. I have spent, over the last decade or so, I've spent the majority of Christmases and summers here. It's a wonderful place. I just went swimming in Lake Michigan again today. Also I want to thank my father-in-law, Andrew McLean, for doing the publicity for this event, and also providing a lot of moral support as well, and the rest of my family, Carol Ruxton, Morgan McLean, and too many others to mention. But thank you for being here, and I want to start by saying that this is an issue that I think has special resonance here in the state of Wisconsin, but I think also the entire country has some connection to this issue. So student loans are a relatively recent public policy phenomenon. They sort of crept up on us really in the wake of the financial crisis about 10 years ago. Before then, the total held debt that students took out to finance their own college educations was a little under $300 billion in the early 21st century. Today, it stands at, by various measures, $1.6 to $1.7 trillion. At the time I was writing the book, it began at 1.3 trillion and ended up at 1.5. So it is rapidly creeping up there, and that measurement is pretty inexact because you're trying to figure out here. Sorry. This will be easier to adjust. Okay. You're trying to figure out how much people have taken out when they don't want to really talk to you about it. This is an issue that a lot of people feel a lot of shame about, and I want to come back to that theme in a few minutes. But a lot of people, when you talk to them about their own student loan debt, they won't tell you the exact amount, and they won't tell you why they have it, and they won't tell you the circumstances they borrowed it in. 45 million people do have student loan debt in the U.S. today. And that began, again, in the wake of the financial crisis, and it began because there was really a perfect storm of mistakes, I would call them, public policy errors that led to this. One was simply the fact that there was less money to go around in public policy. There was a Great Recession, the greatest recession since the Great Depression, as everyone knows. And in that Great Recession, the majority of students go to public institutions in this country, community colleges, state universities, state colleges. 80%, in fact, of students are students of a public university or college. And state legislatures are the primary funding mechanism for them. Now, in that situation where they are really starting to implement austerity and cut their budgets to the bone, they are slashing first higher education budgets. I would say that's, without fail, that is the model that occurred across all 50 states. I usually like to point to Arizona. They're not special in any case, but they are the clearest example. They cut their higher education funding to all their state universities, University of Arizona, Arizona State, by about 45%. From 2008 to, I believe, 2009. And in the following year, the universities decided to increase tuition by roughly the same amount that they lost in their higher education funding from the state legislature. And so where did that money come from? People go to state universities in large part because they're trying to be cost effective about their education. And if they don't have the money, what of course are they going to do? They're going to borrow it. And the primary mechanism people had for getting that money was through the federal government, but it wasn't only through the federal government. As I'm sure we've all encountered, the financial aid application that people have is they go to the FAFSA, which is the Free Aid for Higher Education, something or other, through the U.S. Department of Education, and they check a box saying they want public loans or they want unsubsidized or private loans that are guaranteed by the government. That program no longer exists. But they would check that box and they would say, let's borrow as much as possible so that I can finance my higher education. And that number was allowed to go up because of the financial crisis and knowing that students needed access to higher education. So in large part, it was because people were taking money out to finance their public higher education, but also this began kind of a race to the bottom. For one thing, in 2005, there was a bill that erased the ability to ever discharge your debt, your student loan debt, in bankruptcy. So in addition to the necessity for more student loan debt, you also had that coupled with less protection for borrowers to be able to ever escape that debt. So you created a situation where, or we all created a situation where all of the new college students were ever creeping up the median average amount of money they needed to take out to simply finance their individual education, which up until now had been more of a public good. We'd been financing it, and this had been going on since the 60s and 70s, that tuition had been creeping up somewhat, but this radical increase that happened over 10 years ago was something that really precipitated this really huge disadvantage financially for an entire generation of borrowers. And I don't want to say that it only affects new students. It certainly affected people who already were in the student loan market, and it certainly affected people who decided to finance their children's education. Parent Plus loans were a huge part of what happened. So today we have a situation where routinely, I know that there are too many student loan stories in the news to count. But one of them that I see all the time now is that retirees are seeing their Social Security payments garnished simply to pay their children's student loans. So this is a problem that affects a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and it started simply because we thought we wanted to keep funding something that as a society we were also wanting to apply austerity to. So the people who end up getting hurt in this situation are the people who need to take advantage of that which is something we think they need, which is a public good. And ultimately what this does is, I say in the book, that it undermines two things that are really vital to our society. One thing it undermines, of course, is higher education. And I've been teaching political science in American government for over a decade. And what I can tell you is that students routinely now talk to me in the language of consumers rather than the language of citizenship. They tend to talk to me about, we need certain courses to graduate. And so we want to get out in as quick a time as possible because we're paying tuition and we don't want to pay for another year of education that we don't, quote, need. And, I've tried to argue with them a little bit. There's only so far you can go. But you try to ask, what is it that you don't need? You don't need to pay for another year? That's understandable. Well, what if it was free? What if it didn't cost you anything to go to another year of college? Is that something you'd want to do? And what if you could count that one course, that one humanities or civics course towards your graduation that you say you don't need, that's kind of outside of your comfort zone? Would that be okay? Could you take that? Because really what this is doing is people are getting out into the world. They have a median of $30,000 in student loan debt, and that's the median. There are people at either end of that spectrum, and unfortunately both of them are bad. If you have a lot of student loan debt, of course, it's very likely you went to school for a very long time. Like me, or or it's very likely that if you are at the lower end, if you have $10,000 or so of student loan debt, there's chances are you have less than a bachelor's degree. You might have an associate's degree, but you might have dropped out. And if you dropped out and you have $10,000 of debt and you don't have a college degree, how likely is it that if you default on your debt, you're able to rent an apartment, buy a car, certainly get a mortgage, and sometimes employers are increasingly checking credit. So we have really, I often see various versions of the political cartoon of millennials with a big, old-fashioned prison ball and chain strapped to their foot, right? They're really trying to step out into the world, buy a home, buy a car, and they're simply not able to because they have so much student loan debt, and in many cases they don't have a degree. The way this story started, the way this whole thing started, was simply that I saw a lot of people like me, actually, after I finished my education. I saw online that they were writing their stories in various places across the internet. There were all these forums. One was a kind of an Occupy student debt forum. Another was funded by the Ford and Gates Foundation that was meant to be more of a high-minded policy discussion. And another I was reading was kind of a mix of the two. It was just people who were agreeing with this one organization that was originally called ForgiveStudentLoanDebt.org, but they changed their name to StudentDebtCrisis.org. And there were others. There were many others, and too many to count. But I chose those three to really study in depth because I started to read and do a count of some kind of key concepts that I kept returning to, or they kept returning to. They all were seemingly saying variations of the same thing. They were talking about the unattainability of the American dream. They were talking about never being able to pay off their debt. They were talking about either being teachers or not being able to be teachers, or what their teachers told them. And they were also talking about, forgiveness, how they'd never be able to get forgiven for any of this debt because they'd never be able to declare bankruptcy based on this debt. So these themes I kept returning to, and I saw that people had already written some things about some of those forums, some of those online stories. So I decided I wanted to talk to a few people in person, and some borrowers were kind enough to talk to me and share their stories, and because of the sensitive nature of this, for their own personal kind of financial and really just reputational publicity, they elected to remain anonymous, but their stories are featured very prominently in the book, and I would say in chapter 2 specifically. So I talked to these borrowers, and they told me some of the same things in a little more depth that people online had said, and those things were essentially everything that I've mentioned. But they also talked about calling it one borrower called it Mount Olympus that he would never get to the top of. Another person expressed frustration at being able to take out all of this money, and they were only 18 or 19 years old. And they really didn't even know how much they were taking out. And other people I interviewed confirmed this. An attorney I spoke to, a financial services attorney who also had to remain anonymous, but who was very prominent in his field, essentially told me that it makes no sense that in 2009, something called the CARD Act was passed. And the CARD Act didn't allow financial services companies to be able to go to college campuses and market credit cards to undergraduates for more than $500 of a credit limit. So at the same time that we're saying that you're not responsible enough to take out $501, we're saying that you can take out $10,000 a year. It simply doesn't add up, it doesn't make sense, and it also is just irresponsible publicly. So I talked to people who are borrowers, but they were so good at really talking about what some of the traditional pitfalls were of borrowing as students that I decided to expand my reach and talk to people who were had more of an impact on the world of student debt. And I did what's called an ethnography. And what that means is just a $10 word for stepping into a world and writing stuff down. And I talked to legislators. I talked to, in fact, the mayor of Racine now was a state legislator at the time. He's in the book. I also spoke to, I talked to administrators, I talked to faculty, I talked to activists, I talked to people who ran unions and others who advocated for student borrowers, and journalists and attorneys. And all of these people ended up saying the same thing. We told these people to go and borrow as much as they could for their education. We as a society said that they needed this. And now we're telling them that if they can't take the next step, it's their fault. So they did everything right. And it's time that we actually address that and stopped being predatory towards them, and instead talked about our future as a society. So everyone really, when they stopped and thought about it, and anyone who spent any time with this issue and the people affected by it, they have all said the same thing, and that is that we need to have, number one, less reliance on student loans, and number two, we need to have some kind of forgiveness policy towards this huge public policy error that's really taken an entire generation of people backwards rather than forwards. And one thing I argue later on in the book, after I talk to all of these people and kind of contextualize all their interviews, is I talk about solutions. And one of the things that, and they're all political solutions because I'm a political scientist, I'm not an individual kind of financial services analyst, unfortunately, for me, I guess, and for everyone else. But for the political solution, some people are trying various different things. One is simply that I talked to a person in charge of a major union, the American Federation of Teachers. He says that he does workshops on a regular basis because there are exactly two salient public policy programs that address student loan debt for most borrowers. One is income-based repayment, and that's what the majority of people who are in repayment are actually on. So even though we can talk about those 45 million people who currently have student loan debt, only about 2/3 of them are in a state of repayment. The other third are either in deferment, meaning they're still in school, or they're just simply not paying and they're not delinquent, but they're just keeping in touch with their lender. Or they're people who are they're people who are not yet in a state of repayment. They're definitely not people who are paying down the balances on their loan. That is a very small minority of people who are actually lowering the payments on their student loan balances. The rest are simply trying to get by. So even if you're not on the federal government's income-based repayment plan, you could also be on your private lenders like Sallie Mae or Great Lakes student loan income-based repayment plan. But the federal government also has one other program called Public Service Loan Forgiveness. Now that has been in the news recently because the American Federation of Teachers recently decided to sue the Secretary of Education for not implementing that particular plan. Only 500 plus people have actually gotten their total student loan forgiveness, total student loan balance forgiven after 10 years of on-time payments. And so you can miss a payment as long as you have 10 total years, 120 months, 120 payments of public service. So as long as you're working for a charity or a government, you can get your total loan balance forgiven after 10 years. Income-based repayment, it takes you 25 years and then they forgive everything, except unlike public service loan forgiveness, they treat it as income. So if they treat it as income, that means that in 25 years, whatever interest balance you've accumulated is treated as income for that one tax year. So we haven't seen the results of that yet. So really this was passed in 2008, and in, I guess, 2033, we may have a lot of people who are getting very large tax bills and then having to take out more money. So, you know, the cycle continues. So that's why, you know, I always say that this is an issue that's not going away, unless, you know, we decide to address it right now. And one thing that I do in the book is I argue for, I do argue for a large-scale type of forgiveness. And and again, in the news recently, California has passed a Student Borrower Bill of Rights that addresses kind of the front end of this. And of course, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have called for large-scale loan forgiveness. I will say that the Sanders announcement is a little closer to what I recommend, because I recommend more or less a clean slate of increased funding for higher education to the level that we think is appropriate for people to actually get a higher education in this country. But also to, you know, so to wipe the slate clean and to say that obviously this was a mistake. And it's not really, it doesn't have to be that the federal government or any one particular political party is taking the blame. Usually when forgiveness happens or cancellation happens in American political history, we as a society share the blame. And I make the argument that that's very healthy for a democracy. It kind of creates kind of a common bond that it renews your ability to have faith and trust in your governance structure. So let me give you a couple of examples. One is, so Gerald Ford attempted in the 1970s to try to give a partial forgiveness for Vietnam era draft evaders. And he just kept getting more pressure to give a more large-scale forgiveness. And it wasn't until a new president came into office, Jimmy Carter, who was able to kind of defend the policy of forgiving all Vietnam era draft evaders, that we as a country were able to really move on from that particular conversation. Now, Ford, I think, was just hamstrung by probably the political coalition he was in, but it also is a matter of, you know, Ford, because I think he would rather have done that. He did, after all, forgive his predecessor, Richard Nixon, right, completely for any and all crimes and misdemeanors. But also Nixon had himself said that he favored some limited debt forgiveness for physicians in low-income areas, as well as in some limited commercial and public policy areas. Jimmy Carter was not the last person to engage in a forgiveness type of public policy. Ronald Reagan was able to offer amnesty to all people who were in the United States illegally and offer them a path to citizenship. And that was in 1986. And every president since then has engaged in some form of forgiveness and some form of let's move on. Bill Clinton, third world debt. You know, George H.W. Bush and the Eastern Bloc, he talked about forgiving them. He talked about forgiving Germany for the Holocaust. You know, this is a very presidential leadership oriented goal. And it's one that we have found to be particularly helpful in moving on to the next crisis as a society in a more unified way. And the fact that it's done generationally, and the fact that this seems to be a generational problem, I'll return to that tired metaphor just because I don't have a better one. I think it's a perfect storm anyway. It's a perfect storm again. That not only did we have one to create this problem, but we have, you know, this opportunity and we have this ability to do it again now. And we simply need the political will to carry it out. So that's really what the book is about. And you know, sorry, it's not a memoir, but I thought the song title was catchy, and so did my publisher. So, so I want to stop now because, you know, I'm telling you what the book is and kind of what's all in it, and I've basically given you all the spoilers that I can. But I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Yes.
So, if there's a forgiveness. Mm-hmm. Then how do we stop it going forward? Like, all of a sudden, the universities will have enough money so that people don't have to take out loans, or what?
Good question. So, just for the camera, because I'm the only one being filmed. So the question was, if we have forgiveness, then what then? Doesn't the cycle just repeat itself? Is that essentially your question? Well, I would say that this book is more of a call to action than a specific public policy proposal. But I will say that I was impressed with both Warren and Sanders' plans that basically fulfill the spirit of what I'm talking about. Because not only do we have in both plans, not only do we have the idea of a blank slate, but we also have this idea that, particularly in Sanders' plan, the federal government would be creating a fund to be able to finance public higher education universally tuition-free to all 50 states, and for a fraction of the cost of some of our bigger ticket items in the federal budget. So I believe the one estimate has been around for about a decade or so, is roughly $100 billion a year. Compare that to, for example, the Pentagon budget of $600 or $700 billion a year. And again, it's as a society we're deciding kind of how much higher education we want to fund. And again, this is also for public higher education. It's not for private universities. I would argue that a large part of the reason that private universities have been able to raise their tuition so significantly over the last 20 or 30 years. I think I went to a private college in undergraduate. I went to a public high school and a public graduate school. But I went to a private college, and their tuition, I believe, is double what it was when I went there 15 years ago. And I think they're not alone. There's a little pun there. But I would say that the reason they're able to do that is simply because they're able to capitalize on this trend in public policy of being able to take out loans and grants rather than just directly funding the institutions that we want to bring up to par. And those institutions of private education are able to get students that are only there because of federal loans, sometimes through generous financial aid programs that they're able to provide. But almost always a gap is filled between what they're allotted in terms of grants by loans. And they're competing with public higher education very directly, to the point where most students today really see themselves as consumers making a consumer choice, rather than, do I go to my hometown college or university, or do I go to, this big ticket school that is kind of a private Ivy League style classic looking institution, or even a for-profit school. And if you'll allow me, let me answer another question about that, which hasn't been asked. So for-profit higher education has really sprung up and accounts in the last 25 years, and really accounts for about a third, or roughly maybe 40% of all federal student loan debt. And for-profit higher education, and I won't mention the names because this is being recorded, but it's all in the book. So all those institutions that we know of that are not, they're not the traditional nonprofit charitable model. They have shareholders, they have stockholders, and they advertise on TV, and they say, come to our school and we'll give you a fresh start in life. It only costs you 5 times what it costs to go to a community college. And they only graduate, one institution that's probably the most prominent, graduates only about 16% of their students. And they usually, in their marketing, they tend to blame the students essentially for not finishing. They don't say that, oh, we're like community colleges. I've taught at a couple. Community colleges tend to say they have multiple missions. One is to graduate people to with an associate's degree, that kind of they can have an education that's mostly appropriate to an associate's degree. Another is to transfer students, and the other is lifelong education. And so that the community can take classes when they want. They can take a poetry class, or they can take a pottery class, or they can take any class they want, or want to continue their education for other reasons professionally. The for-profit colleges and universities don't say that. They say you come here and it's up to you, and it only costs you $20,000 a year for 4 years. And guess what? You can take out all of your money through the federal student loan program. they actually have a rule called the 90-10 rule that says only 90% of their total revenue can come from, their total tuition revenue can come from federal student loans. But the reason they call it the 90-10 rule is because the other 10% can be financed through the GI Bill. And the GI Bill is also, so you can have up to 10% of your total tuition dollars funded by the Veterans Loan Program that's in the modern GI Bill, the post 9/11 GI Bill. So those are both federal government funding sources, and they're both loans. So places that are calling themselves private colleges and universities and private for-profit colleges and universities are actually funded entirely by taxpayers. The vast majority are. And not only are they funded by taxpayers, they get to cause a disproportionate amount of student loan delinquencies in the people who attend them. So that's a big part of what I talk about in the book, because I interviewed a journalist who's intimately familiar with this issue. So, in other words, they all look the same when you're a student, when you're kind of shopping for a college or university. I think the challenge to us as a society is to make sure that we are appropriately giving it the opportunity for a student to take advantage of an education we think is necessary to having a democracy, a functioning society. So I particularly see, when I teach Intro to American Government primarily, I see a total lack of civic education in K-12 schools nationally, because I've taught in colleges across the country. So it's not a particular state that it's particular to. It's simply after No Child Left Behind in 2001 and other various incentives that caused education funding to be different from how it used to be, incentivized towards federal government funding, that they tend to emphasize STEM, science, technology, and math, and engineering, at the expense of the arts and English and humanities and social studies. And that's a separate issue, but it really is connected to this, because now we're seeing the lack of funding for liberal arts really in higher education as well. And the reason that we have liberal arts, what one author called America's best idea, she talked about how, we really need to, her name's Marilyn Robinson, and writing in Harper's Magazine about 5 years ago, she talked about how most students need to know that the reason that we have libraries that look like cathedrals is because we want to show them the value of education to our daily life and our value as a society. So there's no reason why we should be underfunding that, and there's no reason why we should be pushing people away from that. And that is exactly what an education system financed by consumer loans is doing. It's causing people to think more as customers and consumers and trying to get the best deal, as opposed to actually thinking critically about their education. And that undermines faith in higher education, and it undermines the value of higher education to a democracy. And one more thing about Wisconsin is that Scott Walker, a few years ago, you might remember, attempted to really gut the Wisconsin idea statewide. And the Wisconsin idea was that we create higher education in order to create, and I'm sorry, because I'm not from here originally, I don't remember the exact wording, but essentially it's from citizenship to the ideal education for the state workforce. And so career-oriented education and kind of liberal arts education are two very different things, but you see that one is pretty directly tied to this idea of funding higher education as a consumer good rather than a public good. Anyway, so I'll take another couple of questions. Yeah.
What role do high school counselors have in this, and what proactive things is happening in that field?
Well, high school counselors, without pretending to have expertise about their day-to-day challenges, I will say that I believe they're doing the best that they can in steering students towards what individually is best for them, and trying to get something that approximates a return on investment score for a student. Is it worth it for you to go to a private institution if it means that you're going to have to take out a lot of money to be able to afford to go there? But they're operating within a system that we have not grappled with. And they're operating in a system that really incentivizes looking at it that way rather than looking at it as a, you should be going, the onus should be on a private school to get you to turn away from that publicly financed higher education that's available to you in your community. So individually, I'm sure they're doing the best they could, but of course, if I were to have a conversation with one, which I didn't for this book, but I'm sure that I will very soon because I'm saying this now. But I would probably argue that unless there's a particularly good reason and their parents are entirely funding their education, they should be steering their students towards public higher education. Other questions? Yes?
So the for-profit schools puts me in mind of the of Betsy DeVos and the current situation and the drift, and not necessarily drift, but push toward privatization. And so factor that in to the costs.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me wonder then if the changes that would need to occur are in many ways entirely political.
Yeah. Betsy DeVos is certainly the, not the person who originated this issue or this problem, but she certainly is someone who is not attempting to make it any better. And what I do say, I do mention in the book, I was able to get a bit in before publication time, that she was not really fully implementing public service loan forgiveness, and she certainly has a family history and a personal history of supporting privatization in education. So it all is very plain, really, when you look at the motivations of the people involved. And Betsy DeVos is, by no means probably, I don't think anyone would call her the best education secretary, but also she clearly has a motivation to not allow the success of these particular programs so that borrowers are treated more like just perpetual borrowers. And again, that same financial services attorney, I'll mention him again, in the book he talks about how you're essentially buying a stock in someone's income stream for their entire life. And that is not something that we have a historical precedent for, because bankruptcy has been a part of common law since time immemorial, going back to English common law. And we used to have courts of law and courts of equity. And in courts of equity, you're supposed to say, okay, what's a fair solution? And courts are really not allowed to look at that at this point. And there's been no legal precedent that allows, at this point, for any small scale or large scale loan forgiveness if someone has an undue burden on their financial future. So yeah, it's really I think we're going to see this reach even more of a critical mass than it is right now, simply because it's kind of on the horizon. We're seeing, yes, only 500 of, I believe, 50,000 people have applied. I know it's 1%, so that would put it at about 50,000. But then another 500,000 are eligible for public service loan forgiveness in the long run. They have student loans and they're employed by a charitable institution or the government. And so it's really a small fraction of society that's seeing what really has been our chief public policy solution to this issue. And so it's simply not working, it's dysfunctional. And the income-based repayment, as I said, is really a ticking clock until 2033. And we'll start to see people, if nothing is done, certainly, which I hope it is, we'll see a lot of people really dissatisfied with what they see as a failure of the political system to address their concerns, their material interests. Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, in the 40 years I was in higher education, two things I've always been aware of growing. One is looking at a college degree or a higher education degree, or looking at colleges and universities as business, as a company. And
colleges as a business, yeah.
And looking at the bottom line, how do we save money, all that, which is kind of not a bad thing to look at. However, what they end up doing in this state, and I think a lot of other states, is cutting faculty, cutting faculty salaries. For example, here, if I had taught in Minnesota instead of Minnesota, I would have had $20,000 a year more in salary.
Yeah, so...
And that varies like that, you see?
Absolutely.
And then because of that, you also have a growth, an astounding growth of part-time faculty.
That's right. That's right.
Part-time faculty.
So
who are not necessarily unqualified, but my dear brother-in-law, son-in-law, but you have lost a sense of when a majority of your faculty is part-time. They do not have, they may have the academic credentials, they don't have that sense of this is my home, you know, this is my shop.
Right.
I'm working for it.
So the question is, if I can extrapolate. So the question is that you know, what happens when you go from a system where you have a well-compensated faculty in public higher education to one where you have primarily part-time faculty.
Well, that's one question, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And one is, and certainly there's this idea that where they're cutting faculty, they're not actually cutting instruction. And certainly there's, you know, at the administrative level, there's increasing reliance on part-time faculty. I'm a lecturer myself in the California State University system. But also the larger issue is, you know, there's a misperception that faculty, definitely a misperception that faculty are simply showing up for a, you know, two 1-hour lectures once a week, and that's essentially their workload. There was even a Wall Street Journal article repeating this ridiculous misconception about 3 days ago, where there was an anonymous faculty member was quoting a friend of his, saying that welcome to the racket, where we earn $200,000 a year for a once-a-week lecture, as if to say that that's what all faculty do. I'd say the median faculty salary is roughly equivalent to the median U.S. salary, and it's in addition, you know, there's this idea that faculty are only working when they show up for class. Well, beyond prep and grading, there's a number of other responsibilities that universities are laying at the feet of faculty as well, in large part to compensate for the fact that they are getting these budget cuts. It really all comes back to that we're just simply not pouring the resources into higher education that we need to be able to fulfill its mission. So yeah, so students and faculty and everyone who relies on higher education as a resource and as a public good is shortchanged as a result, definitely.
Do you think it's wrong to think of colleges and universities as businesses, as corporations?
Yes. Do I think it's wrong to think of higher education as a business? Absolutely. I mean, there is a bureaucracy, to be sure, but so is there in government, and so is there in private business, in medicine, in every facet of organizational life in the U.S. and around the world. But is it a business? It is a business to the extent that there are consumers. And so the more there is a consumer mindset, the more there is tuition raised that's financed by individual borrowers rather than us as a society. It is more, the higher tuition is, essentially, the more it is a business. And the more it's financed by loans that you have to have for the rest of your life, the more it is a business. But if we fund it like we fund K-12 education, which there's no reason we can't, then we can certainly treat it more as a public good than we do currently. I think I have time for one more. Yeah.
Partly it's this, but partly there are other things. I don't see a solution I don't even see people spending much time thinking about a global solution. There are binds. Every single state is in a bind with the recession because they have constraints on their budget and decreasing income, and so they have to say, well, what commitments do we have we already guaranteed? Mm-hmm. There also are, I see this happening with immigration also. Sure. I don't see anybody thinking about the big issues of what kind of changes should we have, which reflects our values.
It's real.
And we have divergent values. So I don't see any quick way out of the specific problem with the student loans, but yeah. I don't see any quick way out of the whole way we arrange higher education.
Yeah.
The old days are not coming back.
Okay. So the question was, the old days are not coming back.
Yeah.
So in terms of not having a short-term solution, I mean, I agree that at the individual and at the policymaker level and certainly at the state level, there's really no way to escape the incentive structure that we've created for ourselves. However, at the federal level, I do argue that there is room for movement. And if we were to simply think at the federal level, if there was political will at the national level to be able to fund public higher education broadly understood, and it is pretty broadly understood because they receive federal student loans currently. One thing, and just at a micro level, what the federal government could do tomorrow is stop charging interest for student loans. I mean, why do they want interest on student loans for the majority of people are not repaying them?
I like that answer.
But I mean, that's just one thing, and it's very small. It's a pretty small ticket item. One time, I think it would cost, it gets 63 million. A very small amount for the federal government every year.
Are you talking about a 1-year waiver, for
No.
example, or permanent?
Permanent. So even if so, but that's kind of all just by nibbling around the edges. The point is that if there is to be a generation of people that are actually able to participate in the financial and kind of civic future of the U.S., that we need to be thinking about public policy solutions now before they become much, much larger public policy problems in the next 10 years. And if we're able to have kind of a large-scale forgiveness or cancellation of loan debt financed by whatever it is, Wall Street tax possibly, or just any number of other funding mechanisms over a 10-year period, then we're going to see, instead of an empowered generation, we're going to see a very disempowered citizenry up and coming, because millennials, I believe, at this point are the largest voting bloc. They are not necessarily consistently, but they outnumber certainly Generation X, baby boomers, everyone at this point. So if we're saying to them that we have no solution for what most of them say is their #1 public policy issue, that is the kind of signpost, in my view, of a very dysfunctional republic. So whether or not it's feasible is something that I think we need to grapple with, but we need to grapple with it. Okay. I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, and I want to say that in the interests of I mean, I'm joking, but paying off my student loans, I do have a few books for sale tonight, and they're at an author discount of $30 instead of the $37 that the publisher charges, and that again was not my decision. But I can offer it at $30, and I'll give you a free inscription as well. So thanks for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it.
Definitely.